It's without question the most divisive topic within the Zelda community, and since it was first published in Hyrule Historia in 2011, it has remained a topic of debate. There is a divide between those who like the timeline, who feel that it adds a lot of context to each Legend of Zelda title, and those who are against the timeline, feeling as though games have been shoehorned to fit into places they don't need to. Towards the end of 2024, the Zelda team made an official update to the timeline when they added Echoes of Wisdom into the chronology of Zelda's timeline, and once again, the timeline debate was fast becoming a hot topic within the community. In today's video, I want to take a bit of time to weigh in on Zelda's most controversial topic and address the state of it right now in 2025. Hello and welcome to the Zelda Realm. My name is Joe and it's great to have you with me for today's video. If you do enjoy this video, please consider subscribing. I'll be posting weekly Zelda videos here on the channel. But without further ado, let's get back to today's topic. Since I haven't covered it here before, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to talk through the timeline and the different branches, highlighting the new entry and explaining the context behind its placement. I feel it's so important that we all fully understand this timeline before we begin giving opinions, and if this is your first time seeing the timeline, I hope that I can make sense of it all for you. So here we are on the official Zelda website with the official Nintendo timeline, so let's talk through it. So, we begin with the legend of the goddesses and the hero. We go back to the very origin of the series, and the first game in the timeline is of course Skyward Sword, which released in 2011 I think, and really kind of set some of the foundations of the series. It told of how we have the Triforce, how that cycle happens, and then the iterations of Zelda, Link and Ganondorf throughout the series. We then kind of move on to what they call the Sky Era, the Era of Chaos, the Era of Prosperity, and then the next game that we have in the timeline is the Minish Cap, which sees the rise of Vati and all these things, which is a great game by the way. If you haven't played it, I would recommend trying out, which of course then is brought on with Four Swords, which is the resurrection of Vati. We then have the Hyrulean Civil War, and that then leads to Ocarina of Time. So, Ocarina of Time is where we see the timeline split. I'm going to talk about the simple bit first, before we get into the controversial piece later on. So, Ocarina of Time, as most people know, you have the split between the time traveling of young Link, adult Link, and so let's take the canon ending of the game where the hero is triumphant and then is sent back to be a child. So we go back to the child era, and that brings about the next three games, which is in this setting, which we go straight into Majora's Mask, where the Sacred Realm remains protected, and the demon thief Ganondorf is executed, and that brings us to Twilight Princess, which is kind of the next stage of that story. And finally, with the reincarnation of Ganondorf and the resurrection of Vati, we finish the timeline with Four Swords Adventures. So that's the child era, that's the child timeline. Let's go back to the adult era. So, we have the hero of the winds in a new world. What happens here? Ganondorf is sealed. Ganondorf is resurrected, Hyrule is sealed and then flooded. And then we get to the Wind Waker, where Ganondorf is resurrected and we must defeat Ganondorf at the end of the game, and this is set directly in line with Ocarina of Time. Then we have the direct sequels to the Wind Waker, which of course were Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. So that was the new continent was discovered, a new Hyrule Kingdom was founded, and then we had Spirit Tracks, and that ends that timeline. So all in all, those two timelines, there's only 3 games in them. They're not really that populated. Let's go to the controversial one. So, I have a problem with this, but I'm gonna remain factual, okay? So this takes the idea that the hero is defeated, so it's essentially a non-canon ending to Ocarina of Time where Link dies. So That brings about what's known as the Imprisoning War, which, again, problematic because of the reference to it in Tears of the Kingdom, but that's by the by. The first game then in this timeline, with the resurrection of Ganon, is A Link to the Past. So, young Link is awakened, he gets the sword, and he has to go through and defeat Ganon. That then leads directly into Link's Awakening, which was of course a dream sequence, which then directly leads into, or leads next into, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, which then leads into A Link Between Worlds, which is an absolutely goated game, but many people at the time felt was more like a remake to A Link to the Past than anything else. That then goes into Triforce Heroes, which then goes into Echoes of Wisdom. So there's no direct link between A Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom, so don't get fooled by art styles. They don't necessarily matter in game order. So the Monarchs of Hyrule then use the Triforce. That brings about the Golden Era, which then leads to the tragedy of Princess Zelda, leading into the first game, The Legend of Zelda, which then of course leads into The Adventure of Link. Here's my problem with kind of this span of the timeline, is that it's all based off a non-canonical ending of Ocarina of Time, and they're all just kind of thrown together. There isn't really like a link between them, unlike the other timelines. And then in this timeline what we have is that actually they haven't even placed Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom on the timeline, simply because they're set so far in advance that they clearly feel that there's no need to put them in the timeline because they're not relevant. Because what they officially said about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is that it can be set in any of the three instances. So it can be put at the end of the hero is defeated, it can be put at the end of the child timeline, or the end of the adult timeline. It doesn't matter where it sits, they are right at the end. They are so far in the future that the previous timelines are effectively irrelevant. Alright, so now that we've established the facts, we've gone through the timeline, we've talked through all of the games, I am now going to give an opinion warning. Okay, this next section of the video, so this is me post-edit, the next section is all opinion based. So I just want to say that this is my opinion and you're absolutely entitled to your own opinion, but I would ask just respectful in the comments to each other. We all have our own opinions on the timeline, and I think let's just get along and let's just be friends. Alright, back to you, VoiceOver Joe. As a franchise, Zelda is unlike anything else that Nintendo produces. From gameplay to storytelling to combat design and atmosphere, Zelda has always been different to the rest. The timeline and its release is another example of this. We've known since 2002 that the Zelda team have always had a timeline for their series, which they used for the structure of their releases, and so from their perspective it made sense to release the timeline in 2011. For lore enthusiasts, the hope was that it would add context and a new perspective to their favourite games, and for the most part I do feel that in 2011 this made sense. But the mess for me comes with the release of Breath of the Wild. So it goes without saying that when Breath of the Wild first came out, there was a level of mass hysteria and excitement over the size of the map. Never before had a Zelda game seen so many locations and so many hidden places to explore. When making Breath of the Wild, the team adopted what's known as the 11-second rule in open world game design, the idea being that every 11 seconds you would find something to do, whether that was a Korok puzzle, a shrine, or a place of interest. And it was this technique that allowed them to develop a Hyrule that felt so palatable and explorable despite being in total ruin. But this did not come without its problems. You see, whenever it first released, Breath of the Wild had some small places of interest that called back to some of Zelda's previous titles. One of the springs that we see in Skyward Sword was present here, and there were references to Lon Lon Ranch from Ocarina of Time. Whenever so many iconic locations are referenced to or linked back to previous games, the question that many people had was, where does this fit in the Zelda timeline? Is this a distant future that sits within the same realm as Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time? Or is this a new timeline? Are we now ignoring the timeline? Bear in mind that Breath of the Wild's story covers 10,000 years. We already knew it was going to have to be set in a distant future, and I think at the time, many people would have been okay with Breath of the Wild simply not being part of the timeline. It just doesn't make sense to have such a long period of time, but also to say that yes, these locations that you've seen are the same locations as we've seen in previous games. Let's not forget the Temple of Time in the Great Plateau. This is then further highlighted by the problems brought about in Tears of the Kingdom, where the game explores the founding of Hyrule. So if Hyrule had to be refounded and rediscovered, what does that say about where the placement of these games sit in the timeline? Why is it that all of a sudden these two games effectively become a factory reset to the franchise, and yet we still have iconic locations from the other games present here in Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, as I discussed earlier on? We know that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom sit in the timeline many eras after the rest of the games, and whether you like that or not, I think it's fair to say that Nintendo and the Zelda team pushed themselves into a bit of a sticky situation that they really had no way to get out of, and so this felt like the next best thing that they could come up with. So my feeling right now in 2025 is that the Zelda timeline is a bit of a mess, and while it provides some really good context for Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, which are very clearly set directly after Ocarina of Time, it creates this unnecessary level of division in the Zelda community. Now don't get me wrong, Breath of the Wild is absolutely a must-play title that signified really the evolution of the franchise, the evolution that the franchise absolutely needed, and it was a step in the future. But whenever we see Echoes of Wisdom just get thrown in and see a placement that really doesn't matter, I don't tend to think about where in the timeline this takes place, although I did ask myself that question at release. And while for me the timeline has served to add context or intrigue to some of the games, I can understand why for some it's an unnecessary mess. Because when you play Echoes of Wisdom, there is no part of me that plays the game and thinks this is where it should go or this is where it needs to go. And while we established that we no longer need to have Link be the playable protagonist set in the timeline, my biggest fear is that the longer this goes on, the messier it becomes. We have a movie expecting to release in the upcoming future, and as of right now, we have absolutely no idea in what way the franchise will go. So whatever direction we turn, I think we're going to see a bit of controversy and a bit of difficulty with the timeline. For me, I feel the timeline was unnecessary in the first place. It's not something I ever really thought about before it was released. Even now, it's not something I think about a lot anymore. And I wouldn't let the position of a game in the timeline affect my enjoyment of the game itself. However, knowing that there are inconsistencies with timeline placement, different references and games, I think it's caused too much of a headache to be worth it anymore. I love the lore of Zelda and I love what it has to offer, but I worry that we are in a position now that is untenable for the series. If changes are suddenly made, we will rightly be upset because it will indicate that really it isn't that important. Or if a new game releases that tries to fix some of the mistakes in the timeline, the risk is run of retconning previous lore foundations in older titles. It's a mess, and frankly, it's an element of the franchise that I spend as little time as possible worrying about. But what are your thoughts? Please do let me know in the comments and give me your perspective on the Zelda timeline, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel for more weekly Zelda videos. I appreciate you watching this, but why not check out this video selected just for you. Until next time, have a good one.